ओम श्री परमात्मने नमः। नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जयमुदीरयेत्। श्रीमद् भगवद गीता साधका संजीवनी second chapter, contents of the Gita summarized, verses 11 to 30. Description of Sankhya Yoga, discipline of knowledge. Lord Krishna preaches the gospel of freedom from grief to grieved Arjuna and says, verse 11, Shri Bhagavan Uvacha Ashocyan Anvashocastvam Pragyavadanscha Bharse Gatasun Agatasuncha Nanu Shochanti Panditaha. The blessed Lord said, Arjuna, you grieve for those who should not be grieved for, yet speak words of wisdom. The wise grieve neither for the living nor for the dead. Comment. A man is grieved when he classifies objects and persons into two divisions, one's own and not one's own, such as our kinsmen and not our kinsmen, of our caste and not of our caste, of our stage of life and not of our stage of life, our followers and not our followers. We have the sense of mind, attachment, love, and desire for those whom we regard as ours. Through these, the sense of mind and desire, etc., evils such as grief, worry, fear, perturbation, commotion, and strain, etc., spring up. The root of all evils is the sense of mind and desire, etc. This is the rule. Arjuna had attachment for the Kuru family, and because of the possibility of the destruction of the family, he was grieved. There are two things in the world, the real and the unreal, the soul and the body. Both of them are not to be grieved. The real is imperishable and therefore should not be grieved for, and the unreal is bound to perish, as it is perishing every moment, so it should not be grieved for. It means that they are grieved for only because of ignorance or lack of discrimination. Whatever circumstances in the form of birth, death, profit, loss, etc., a man finds himself in is the result of his fate, namely his previous actions. It is sheer ignorance to feel happy or sad in those favorable or unfavorable circumstances because they are transient. The wise don't grieve for anyone. You also say that with the destruction of a family, its age-old traditions disappear. Women become corrupt and there ensues an intermixture of castes which leads to hell, and being deprived of the offerings of rice ball and water, their means also fall. These words, like the wise, also prove that the body is perishable while the soul is imperishable. Had the soul not been imperishable, how could you have feared the fall of slayers and members of the family? Further, you could have not worried about the fall of means. Your worry and fear prove that the body is perishable while its master, the soul, is eternal. So you should not grieve for them. It is out of ignorance that you grieve for the bodies because they will perish. You should not grieve for them. Such grief is a blunder. It is also a mistake to grieve for those who are dead because they have to suffer torture if people here grieve for them. The departing soul has to drink and eat the tears and phlegm shed by the people here. Similarly, we should not grieve or worry for those who are living because grief, worry does not help them in any way. We should rather rear and help them. In the next two verses, the Lord explains why it is unwise to grieve for what is imperishable. Verse 12. Na tva evaham jatu nasam na tvam neme janadhipaha na चैव न भविष्यामः सर्वे वयम् अतः परम्. In fact, there was never a time when I or you or these kings were not existent, nor is it a fact that we shall cease to be in future. An exceptional fact. Lord Krishna in this verse wants to say that the bodies are perishable while the self is imperishable, and it is a rule that what exists in the beginning and the end also exists in the middle, and what does not exist in the beginning and the end does not exist in the middle either. But the question arises that now in the middle these bodies are visible. The answer is that the senses, mind and intellect with which we see and the worldly objects which are seen both are perishable and change every moment. The man self identifies himself with the seen, then he is called the seer. When the instruments of perception and the objects of perception are all perishable and transient, then how can the apparent onlooker be permanent? The apparent entity of the seer onlooker is there because of the affinity between the seer, the senses, and the seen. In case there is no such affinity, then this apparent entity of the seer is melted away. But the base of the apparent entity, which is truth, persists. That truth is called the base of creation, preservation, and destruction, and eliminator of all seeming entities. These names, base and illuminator, are only in relation to the objects which they base and illumine. In absence of those objects, the truth ever remains as it is. He who has an eye on that truth can never grieve. This way, I, you, and these kings are not to be grieved at all. Verse 13. Dehino asmin yatha dehe kaumaram yauvanam jara तथा देहांतरा प्राप्तिर धीरस तत्रा न मुह्यति. Just as boyhood, youth and old age are attributed to the soul through this body, even so it attains another body. The wise man does not get deluded about this. Comment. As babyhood, youth and old age are the different stages of physical body, so attaining another body after death is the stage for the subtle and causal body. If we perceive in the right perspective, we come to know that the body does not pass through babyhood, youth and old age only, but it changes every moment. Similarly, subtle and causal bodies also change every moment. Now the question arises that we can perceive our physical body, but we don't perceive our subtle and causal body and their change. Wakefulness, sleep and sound sleep, respectively, are regarded as the states of physical, subtle and causal bodies. In sleep, dream, a baby sees itself a baby, a youth sees himself a youth, and an old man sees himself as an old man. It proves that the subtle body also changes. Similarly, in childhood, one gets more sound sleep than in youth, and in old age, it further decreases. It shows that there is a change in causal bodies also. Secondly, a man is more refreshed in his childhood and youth after sleeping than he is in his old age. It also proves the change in causal bodies. When one gets the body of a god, a bird, or an animal, etc., because of identification of the self with the body, one thinks oneself the same. It is the change in subtle body. Similarly, the nature, habit of a god is different from that of a bird or an animal. It shows change in causal body. A man passes through babyhood, youth and old age, and thus there is a change in his state, but he experiences that he is the same. It proves that there is no change in his self, soul. Here a doubt comes to our mind that we experience the change in the physical body, but we have no knowledge about our previous bodies after getting new bodies? The answer is that there is so much of pain at the time of death and rebirth that one forgets one's previous birth. When a man suffers from paralysis or old age, his memory becomes weak. Similarly, by the pangs of death and birth, one sinks into oblivion of his previous birth. But one who dies suddenly without any pain can have memory of his previous birth. When a man rises after a sound sleep, he says that he slept soundly and he was not aware of anything. It means that he knows that he was not aware of anything during sound sleep. This knowledge of nothingness by the self proves that the self existed even during the sound sleep. Thus, his own self existed before his sleep, during his sleep, and also after his sleep. That is, the self soul exists continuously. None feels his non existence at any time. Rather, he feels his existence incessantly. He who feels himself separate from the body realizes that he is liberated, and in that liberated state he ever remains. In that liberated state, he may not know what bodies he possessed in the past, but his realization that he is separate from the body remains intact. And he is never deluded about this because he knows that he is different from the body. Now, Lord Krishna urges us that we should be indifferent to the sorrow and suffering arising from transitory and perishable things like body, etc. Verse 14. Matra sparshastu kantya shitoshna sukha dukkha agmapaino nityastans bharata. O son of Kunti, the sense objects which give rise to the feelings of heat and cold, pleasure and pain, etc., are transitory and fleeting. Therefore, Arjuna bear them patiently, namely, remain unaffected by them or ignore them. Comment. The body and senses and their actions have a beginning and an end, while you as a spectator are different from them. They always change, but you never change. Therefore, you should remain unaffected by them. That is, you should ignore them. To remain unaffected, untainted, is called here titiksha. In the next verse, Lord Krishna tells the result of remaining unaffected by the contacts of senses with their objects. Verse 15. Yam hi na vyatyante te purusham purusharishbha sama dukha sukham dhiram so amritvaya kalpate. O the best of men, the man to whom pain and pleasure are alike and who is not tormented by these sense objects becomes eligible for immortality. Comment. Men generally try to change the inevitable circumstances, but Arjuna, instead of trying to change them, has thought to attain benediction, which shows that he is the best of men. The man of steady wisdom remains alike in pleasure and pain. He is the experiencer of pleasure and pain only when he is attached to the three gunas, qualities, modes, born of matter, nature. But when he gets fixed in the self, he does not experience pleasure and pain and becomes unruffled. To the man of steady wisdom, the sense objects don't give pain. The pleasure ensuing from the contact of sense objects is perturbing. Similarly, the pain arising from their separation is also perturbing. He who has an eye on equanimity can't be happy or sad by these objects. An exceptional fact. This human life has not been bestowed upon the man to experience pleasures and pain, but to attain the supreme peace, having obtained which he has nothing else to seek. If we remain greedy and desirous to acquire favorable circumstances, we shall not be able to make use of those circumstances because our energy will be wasted in enjoyment of those circumstances rather than in making proper use of them. Similarly, if we grieve in the unfavorable circumstances or in their possibility, we will not be able to make use of them. Rather, we will be brooding over them. To get pleased with the favorable circumstances is their enjoyment. The use of favorable circumstances for mere maintenance of the body and for the welfare of poverty stricken people is their proper use. There is the proper use of desirable circumstances if we, having satisfied our needs, use them to serve the needy and the destitute instead of enjoying them ourselves. Actually, our riches are for the needy and the poor. So, we should utilize them for their welfare. These are the poor and the destitute who have enabled the rich to be proud of their riches. Had all the others been multimillionaires, could these millionaires have got pleasure and pride of their being millionaires? No. These poor and destitute people are the cause of their pleasure and pride. Therefore, the rich people should serve the desolate and the destitute as it is their duty to do so. Now the question arises how to make use of the undesirable circumstances. The answer is that the undesirable circumstances are painful when there is desire for pleasure. If that desire is renounced, the undesirable circumstances can't be painful. As a patient is given bitter medicines and painful injections, he does not get displeased. Rather, he is pleased because he knows that the bitter medicines and painful injections are the cures for his disease. Thus, it is a proper use of undesirable circumstances to bear the pain without having any grudge against it. If he gets displeased with bitter medicines, etc., that is brooding over unfavorable circumstances, it will result in great misery. If we enjoy pleasures and are tormented by pain, we may get heaven or hell, but can't be eligible for salvation because salvation is attained by those who remain alike in pleasure and pain. In the next three verses also, there ensues nature of the real spirit and the unreal matter body. Verse 16. नास्तो विद्यते भावो ना भावो विद्यते सतः उभयोरपि दृष्टो अन्तस्त्व अन्योस्तत्त्वदर्शिभिः. The unreal has no existence and the real never ceases to be. The truth of both has been perceived by the seers of truth. Comment. This body neither existed in the past before birth nor will exist in the future after death and is also perishing at present. Thus, actually, it is non-existent. This body is the world in miniature. The change in the body signifies the change in the world. Similarly, the non-existence of the body signifies the non-existence of the world in all the times. The entire world is burning continuously in fire in the form of time. On firewood being burnt, ash remains. But this time fire devours the world in such a way that no remains are left. There is total annihilation of the world. Therefore, it has been said that the unreal has no existence. The real never ceases to be. The Atma, spirit or soul, remains the same. It existed before the birth of the body, exists now when the body is undergoing change, and will exist after the death of the body. Similarly, God also ever remains the same, while the world undergoes a change every moment. A vital fact: the world is kaleidoscopic. It changes every next moment, so it can't be seen in the same state the very next moment. The bodies are taking birth and dying every moment, but the process is not perceived with these dull physical eyes. Similarly, the world is also perishing all the time, but it is not perceived because the senses, mind and intellect etc. also belong to the same class to which the world belongs. So, how can the perishable perceive the perishable? Only the imperishable self, spirit, can perceive it. Secondly, the self can't perform any activity without assistance of the world, body, senses, mind and intellect. It proves that all activities take place in the world rather than in the self. The self has no affinity with activities and objects. It proves that the world with body, mind, senses, and intellect, etc., is non existent. Only the Oversoul, God, is ever existent, who ever remains untainted and is the base and illuminator of the entire world. Now, in the next two verses, there is the description of the real and the unreal. Verse 17. Avinashi tu tad vidhi yena sarvam edam tatam vinasham avyayasya na kaschit kartum arhati. Know that to be imperishable by which all this world is pervaded, for none can bring about the destruction of the indestructible. Comment. The Lord advises Arjuna to know that imperishable entity. He explains that this entity is abstract. By telling it abstract, the Lord means to say that this abstract, imperishable entity is pervading the whole world, which appears as separate from the entity. In reality, only this all pervading entity exists, while the world, which appears to exist, does not really exist. This whole world is pervaded by that imperishable entity, as all the ornaments made of gold have nothing but gold, the weapons made of iron have nothing but iron, the pots of clay have nothing but clay, and in ice there is nothing but water. Similarly, this world is pervaded by Sat, real, imperishable. So, in the world, there is nothing to be known except the real. The spirit, soul, is imperishable, while the body is perishable and is perishing every moment. No one can check its process of destruction, but whether you wage the war or recoil from it, the imperishable can't be destroyed and the perishable can't be saved. Verse 18. Antavanta ime deha nityasyoktah sharirinaha anashino pramyasya tasmad yudhyasva bharta. These bodies of the imperishable, indefinable and eternal soul are spoken of as perishable. Therefore, O Arjuna, fight. An exceptional fact. In the 17th and 18th verses, there is particularly an explanation of the real and the unreal because the Lord wants Arjuna to realize the real. By realizing the real, one gets rid of the unreal spontaneously. Thus, by realizing this fact, he should discharge his duty. It shows that every human being, without any distinction of caste, creed, color, or stage of life, can follow freely either the discipline of action or discipline of knowledge for his salvation. But in practical life, the duty should be discharged according to one's varna, caste, and ashrama stage of life by following the ordinance of the scriptures. Therefore, here Lord Krishna orders Arjuna to fight. Up to the previous verse, there is description of the seers who know the soul as imperishable. In the next verse, Lord Krishna, in order to emphasize the same fact, speaks of those who do not regard the soul as indestructible by a negative inference. Verse 19. Ya enam veti hantaram yash chanam manyate hatam ubhau tau na bijanito nayam hanti na hanyate. Both of them are ignorant. He who holds the soul as slayer and he who considers it as slain. For the soul neither slays nor is slain. Comment. One who considers the soul as slayer is ignorant because the soul has no doership. But by identifying with the body, it accepts itself as doer. As an artisan, however clever he may be, can't work without tools. Similarly, the soul without body can't do anything. It means that the self is not the doer. It, by identifying itself with the body, assumes itself to be the doer of actions performed by the body. If a man does not identify himself with the body, he is not at all the doer of any activity. One who holds the soul as slain is also ignorant. As the soul is never the slayer, so is it never slain, because the soul always remains unaffected and unchanged. Only the perishable and changeable can be slain. How can the imperishable and unchangeable be slain? The soul is neither the destroyer nor can it be destroyed. It is always the same without any change. Therefore, one should not grieve. In the next verse, the Lord explains how this soul is immortal. Verse 20. Na jayate mriyete va kadachin nayam bhutva bhaveta va na bhuyaha ajo nityaha shashvato ayam purano na hanyate hane mane sharire. The soul is neither born nor does it die, nor does it become on coming into being. It is unborn, eternal, constant and primeval. It is not killed even when the body is slain. Comment. The body constituted of elements undergoes 6 kinds of modifications: to be born, to exist, to change, to grow, to decay and to perish. But the soul remains unaffected by these changes. The Lord is explaining this fact in this verse. In the 19th verse, Lord Krishna told Arjuna that the soul neither slays nor is slain. In the 20th verse, he explained how it is not slain. Now in the next verse, he explains how it does not slay. Verse 21. Veda vinashinam nityam ya enam ajam avayam katham sa purushaha partha kam ghatyati hanti kam. How can a man who knows this soul to be imperishable, eternal and free from birth and decay, O Partha, slay anyone or cause anyone to be slain? Comment. The soul is neither the agent, doer, nor the action, object. Therefore, one while discharging duty should not grieve while slaying anyone or causing anyone to be slain, but discharge one's duty in accordance with the ordinance of the scriptures. In the next verse, Lord Krishna explains that the soul is free from modifications by giving an illustration. Verse 22. Vasansi jirnani yatha vihaya navani grhanati naroparani तथा श्रीराणि विहाय जीर्णान्यन्यानि संयाति नवानि देहि. As a man discarding worn-out clothes puts on new ones, so the embodied soul, casting off worn-out bodies, enters into others which are new. Comment. Casting off of worn-out bodies is called death, while its acquiring new bodies is called birth. So long as this embodied soul has connection with Prakriti, it goes on acquiring new bodies according to actions of the past or according to the thought at the moment of death. How can the illustration of old clothes befit bodies when bodies of even children and young men die? The answer is that end of age means the worn out bodies, whether they are of children or young men or old men. Here a doubt arises that a man is free in casting off old clothes and putting on new ones. but he is not free in casting off the old body and entering into the new one. The answer is that here Lord Krishna does not mean to talk about freedom and dependence. His aim is to dispel the grief arising from the separation of the body. One should not grieve over the death of a body because the soul remains unattached and unchanged. Another question that arises is that a man is happy by discarding old clothes and putting on new ones, whereas he feels grieved while casting off the old body and getting into the new one. The reason is that a man, by identifying himself with the body, wants to live alive and thinks the death of the body as his own death. Thus, he is sad. The grief, sadness, is the result of the desire to live, not because of death. But if he discriminates between the real and the unreal, he is not sad. He rather rejoices. Thus, it is because of his ignorance that he weeps. In his ignorance, he is like a child who weeps while his old clothes are taken off and he is made to put on new ones. Something noteworthy. Now the question arises why this cycle of birth and death has been going on from time immemorial. From the viewpoint of the discipline of action to reap the fruit of virtuous and evil actions. From the viewpoint of the discipline of knowledge due to ignorance, and from the viewpoint of the discipline of devotion due to disinclination for God. This cycle of birth and death goes on. Out of these three reasons, the chief one is God has granted liberty to living beings to make proper use of their lives, but they have misused it, and so they have to go through the cycle of birth and death. They can be free from this cycle by making proper use of this liberty. It means that if they start working for the welfare of others by renouncing their selfishness, they will be free from this cycle. Moreover, negligence in discrimination is the root of birth and death. If we attach importance to discrimination, we can be free from shackles of birth and death. Similarly, disinclination for God is the cause of birth and death, which can be obliterated by having an inclination for Him. In the next three verses, there is a description that the soul is super mundane. Verse 23. नैनं छिन्दन्ति शस्त्राणि नैनं दहति पावकः नाच्यैनं क्लेद्यन्ते आपो न शोष्यति मारुतः. Weapons can't cut the soul, nor can fire burn it. Water can't drench it, nor can wind make it dry. Comment. Out of the five gross elements, four can't hurt the soul. Now the question arises, why has Lord Krishna not mentioned the fifth element, ether? The answer is that Akasha, ether, is actionless. Earth, water, fire, wind are born of ether and they are incapable of acting on ether which is inert. Therefore, when they can't even hurt ether, how can they hurt the soul, which is beyond the reach of even matter or nature? Prakriti. These elements with attributes can't reach the soul, which is without attributes. The soul is eternal. All the four elements, such as the earth, etc., are activated by the power of the soul. So, how can they impair the soul, the source of their power? The soul is all-pervading, while the four elements, such as the earth, etc., are the pervaded ones. How can the pervaded ones hurt the all-pervading one? Verse 24. Achedyo ayam adahayo ayam akledyo shoshya evacha nityaha sarvagataha sthanur achlo ayam snatnaha. This soul is uncleavable, incombustible, and neither can be wetted nor dried. It is eternal, all-pervading, stable, constant, and everlasting. Comment. This soul is incapable of being cut. Even incantation and curse can't cut this soul, while they can cut the body, as Shakalya was beheaded by Yagyavalkya's curse because the farmer could not answer the latter's questions. This soul can't be burnt by fire, as the hunter was burnt to ashes by Damayanti's curse. Only that can be burnt by fire which is prone to fire. The soul is beyond burning. The soul is impervious to water, as it is said that the tune of Malakosha's song wets a stone and the moonlight wets the moon gem. But this soul can't be wetted by them. This soul can't be dried by wind, incantation, curse, and medicines, etc., as sage Agastya dried the sea. Something noteworthy. The world is transitory while the soul is eternal. Matter is kaleidoscopic while the soul is stable. All the things and persons, etc., of the world are movable while the soul is immovable, and all the worldly objects are subject to birth and decay while the soul is everlasting. Lord Krishna means to say that men identify themselves with the bodies and material things, and so they don't realize that they are different from the worldly things, but even then the soul remains uniform and constant all the time. Verse 25. Avyakto ayam achintyo ayam avikaryo ayam uchyate tasmad evam viditvenam nanu shochitum arhasi. This soul is unmanifest, unthinkable, and immutable. Therefore, knowing it as such, you should not grieve. Comment. The soul, unlike the body, is unmanifest because it can't be perceived by any one of the senses. Mind and intellect, etc., can't be perceived by senses, but they are thinkable. But this soul is unthinkable. This soul is immutable, that is, it does not undergo any change, while matter is changing all the time. The cause of the entire creation is matter. That causative nature, matter is subject to change. The soul is beyond any change as it is transcendental. Thus, by knowing, realizing this soul as uncleavable, incombustible, unmanifest, everlasting, and immutable, etc., one can't grieve. Now, in the next two verses, Lord Krishna says that even if one thinks of the soul as changeable, which is against the principle, one should not grieve. Verse 26. Atha chanam nitya jatam nityam va manyase mritam tathapi tvam mahabaho na evam shochitum arhasi. O mighty armed, even if you regard this soul as constantly undergoing birth and death, even then you should not grieve. Comment. A seed sown in the earth assumes different shapes: sprout, plant, tree, and then it dries up and decays. The fact is that the seed undergoes change every moment. If this seed had remained the same even for a moment, how had it passed different stages up to the last stage of its drying up as a tree? It gave up its prior form. It is its death, and it assumes a new shape. It is its birth. Thus, it passes through birth and death every moment. Similarly, this body also undergoes a change every moment. Sperm gets mixed with ovum, and the mixture grows into a baby, which is born. With its birth, the process of death sets in, which culminates in death. Thus, this body undergoes a continuous change. It is born, it decays, and dies. Therefore, Lord Krishna says to Arjuna that if he holds this view that the soul undergoes birth and death like the body, there is no ground for grieving. Verse 27. Jatasya hi dhruvo mrityur dhruvam janma mritasya cha tasmad apriharya arthe na tvam shochitum arhasi. Death is certain of him who is born, and rebirth is certain of him who is dead. You should not therefore grieve over the inevitable. Comment. This cycle of birth and death has been going on from time immemorial and will continue up to eternity. As the sun has risen, it will certainly set, and if it is set, it will definitely rise. This is an inevitable fact which is known to all. Therefore, none grieves over the setting of the sun. It implies that one should not grieve over death of anybody. In verses 26 and 27, Lord Krishna means to say that all the worldly things, including the bodies, undergo change from one form to another. Abandoning the first form is called death, and change to the second form is called birth. One should not grieve over this cycle because it goes on. In the next verse, Lord Krishna mentions the simple law of nature about birth and death. Verse 28. Avyakta-dini bhutani vyakta madhyani bharta avyakta nidnani eva tatra ka paridevna. O Bharta, all beings are unmanifest before they were born and will become unmanifest again when they are dead. They are manifest only in the intermediate stage. What is the point then for lamentation? Now the Lord dwells upon the spiritual nature of the soul. Verse 29. आश्चर्यावत् पश्यति कश्चिद् एनम् आश्चर्यवद् वदति तथैव च अन्याः आश्चर्यवच्चैनम् अन्याः शृणोति श्रुत्वाप्येनं वेद न चैव कश्चित्. One perceives the soul as marvelous, another speaks of it as marvelous, another hears of it as marvelous, while none knows it, only by hearing of it. Comment. The knowledge of the self is not a subject of senses. The self can be known by the self itself. It is beyond the access of senses. As I am, this knowledge requires no proof, no instrument. It is self-evident. This consciousness can't be experienced as separate from I. This is intuited by the person himself. This is not a subject of senses and intellect. Therefore, the knowledge of the self is said to be marvelous. The body is of three kinds: physical, gross, subtle, and causal. The body which is nourished by food and water for its growth is physical, gross body. This gross body is the object of senses. The subtle body consists of 17 elements, 5 senses, 5 organs of action, 5 vital layers, mind and intellect. This subtle body can be perceived by intellect and not by senses. The latencies, ignorance, is the causal body. If we reflect on the three kinds of bodies, it is evident that the gross body is not the self, as it changes every moment, and it is an object of knowledge. Similar is the case with the subtle body. The causal body is an evolute of nature, but the self is beyond nature. Therefore, the causal body is also not the self. But as far as the knowledge of the self is concerned, it is beyond them, and this knowledge is marvelous. When the soul ceases its identification with the body, it knows itself, and therefore it has been said that one perceives the soul as marvelous. What is knowing of the self by the self? There is a difference between doing, perceiving, and knowing. Doing involves organs of action. Perceiving involves senses, while knowing is done by the self itself. The senses actually don't know, rather they only perceive, which is useful in daily transaction. This knowledge of knowing oneself by one's own self is of two kinds. I am different from the body and the world. And secondly, I have identity with God. In other words, it can be said, I have no affinity with the kaleidoscopic, perishable world, while I have constant affinity with unchangeable, imperishable God. After possessing this kind of knowledge, one can know the soul in reality. This knowledge is beyond the reach of speech and intellect. The next is the concluding verse about the discrimination between the body and the soul. Verse 30. Dehi nityam avadhyoyam dehe sarvasya bharta tasmat sarvani bhutani na tvam shochitum arhasi. O Bharata, this soul residing in the bodies of all can never be slain. Therefore, you should not grieve for any being. Something noteworthy. In this section, from the 11th to the 30th verses, there is a description that the soul which is imperishable and real is different from the body which is perishable and unreal. Unless one can discriminate between the soul and the body, one can't follow any one of the disciplines either of disinterested action or knowledge or devotion. Not only this, but also one who wants to go to heaven should know the distinction between the two. Otherwise, after the death of the body, who will go to heaven? Therefore, all the philosophers who are believers, in spite of having different opinions about philosophy, agree to the fact that the soul is different from the body. Here, the Lord wants to explain this distinction. This is everyone's own experience also, that the body changes from babyhood to youth and then to old age. But there is an unchangeable one who knows this change. That one is the soul. Therefore, the changeable and the unchangeable can never be identified. In this section, Lord Krishna has not used the philosophical terminology because people think that philosophy is a subject to study only. So he has used such words as the real and the unreal, the perishable and the imperishable, etc. One who can discriminate between the two is not grieved in the least, while one who merely studies philosophy is grieved. A man may study the six systems of philosophy and may possess knowledge that there are the absolute, the soul, the nature, and the world, but his knowledge is purely theoretical. On the other hand, there is a practical striver or a devotee who wants to realize his identity with God, or who wants to surrender himself to God by renouncing his assumed affinity for Prakriti and the world. Om Tat Sat. All glories to Sri Partha Sarthi Lord Sri Krishna. All glories to Bhagavad Vani Srimad Bhagavad-Gita. Shri Hari Arpanamastu.